right, good afternoon. This is the last panel of the day before our keynote that ends the day by Gina McCarthy. And I'm Jayni Hein. I'm the Policy Director here at the Institute for Policy Integrity at NYU School of Law. And I'm thrilled. We have a terrifically accomplished group of panelists here today, and we're going to talk about emerging issues in natural resources law and policy. We're going to spend the majority of our time talking about federal public lands and how the Department of the Interior manages our vast federal natural resources, including coal, oil, and natural gas, as well as its protected lands and waters. So Interior is directed by statute to conserve some of these lands in their natural condition for present and future generations. Federal statutes actually direct that Interior manage these lands according to the principle of multiple use, which requires accounting for a wide array of values, including energy production, but also recreation, wildlife, watershed protection, and much more. But the rhetoric and the actions of the Department of the Interior under Secretary Zinke mark a sharp departure from these statutory mandates. Interior has embraced an energy dominance approach that prioritizes fossil fuel extraction over these other values. And it has repealed regulations that it claims unduly burden industry. But Interior is still required to follow the law, including its own statutes, as well as the Administrative Procedure Act, that requires reasoned decision-making. Here at Policy Integrity, we've been pushing back against egregious regulatory rollbacks that have no rational basis. But we could not and we do not do this work alone. And the three individuals on this stage have been invaluable allies to us, as well as to several other environmental and conservation organizations seeking to uphold the rule of law and protect our public lands and resources. So first, we will hear from Brenda Mallory. She is the Executive Director and Senior Counsel for the Conservation Litigation Project. She is also the former General Counsel of the White House Council on Environmental Quality. Following Brenda, we will hear from Nada Culver. She is Senior Counsel and Director of the Wilderness Society's BLM Action Center. And last but not least, we will hear from David Hayes. And David is the Executive Director of the State Energy and Environmental Impact Center at NYU Law and the former Deputy Secretary of the Interior.
So good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Jayni and Ricky both for the invitation to be part of this program. It's been, as usual, kind of thought-provoking sitting here and hearing the other panelists this morning. I also want to congratulate them on their 10th year anniversary. I know personally of their work and what they've been doing over that time and have been both enjoyed and found it invaluable, but just hearing others regale and list off some of the specific things was very nice to hear as well. So thank you for what you do. And particularly now when we are in a time where the focus on rationality and economics and approaches to rulemaking is even more important. In fact, I thought it's almost comical at some level in this administration at this point to be talking about emerging public lands issues under a heading that talks about the quest for rationality, because it seems like we have anything but that at this point. There is much more of a grudge match that seems to be dominating the way in which the administration is approaching its public lands policy. And as we get further into it, it's sort of expanding from being simply about just get rid of the things that President Obama did or the Obama administration did, and expanding more into sort of policies and things that were important in public lands policy for decades. In fact, I want to read a quote from an article that Rob Glicksman wrote. Rob Glicksman is a professor at George Washington. Penned an article this summer that I thought captured at least my sense of what's happening in the public lands world, and I want to share with you. The Trump agenda seeks more than just to return to the pre-1960 regime. and it goes beyond trying to wipe out reforms of the New Deal and the Progressive Era. The administration's touchstone for public land management harkens back to 1872. That was the year Congress passed the General Mining Law, which made minerals such as gold and copper and the title to the lands containing them available to anyone, basically for free. The law epitomized an era in which disposition of federal lands and resources was the predominant goal, and in which lands that were retained were to be milked dry of extractable commodities. The Trump approach is a radical rejection of virtually every reform of public land law in the last 100 years. And I think in this area in particular, I think unlike in the environmental area, environmental area is much newer than public lands. We've had public lands law evolving over a century, and so you can see how the changes that are being picked up and as part of their focus are really are focused on themes that actually were much more relevant in an earlier time before public participation and the reforms of the 70s came about and encouraged a different approach to how we think about the role of the public in public lands management. But that's not what we're seeing or is being encouraged in this administration. Their view, however, would not be to appreciate the way that Fixman describes it, although we're all looking at the same facts. In a recent press release from the Department of Interior touting President Trump's, I think, 500 days, they say that public lands are once again available for use. And I think that notion of that the lands are for use is, I think, very important in the way that they are thinking about how we should be managing the public lands. There's a heavy emphasis on what the economic value is that can be offered through the public lands, and on sort of traditional uses like hunting and ranching and grazing activities. But much less focus on the idea that there are areas that are so special or unique that we should be thinking about conservation or preservation. And those themes, I think, are much diminished. And in part, I think what the administration reflects in their discussion of the narrative is that things in their mind had really shifted too far away from initial notions of what was appropriate public lands management, and not really thinking about the opportunities that exist to allow for more use of the resources, and the resources being used was really an important part of how I think the administration sees the value of public lands. One thing that Jayni alluded to is the fact that the Secretary of Interior has a broad degree of discretion, and that is true. I think it is clear that the expectation is that the Secretary is able to manage these public lands, taking into consideration the variety of statutory mandates, and to do that without the same set of explicit criteria that you sometimes see in the statutes in the Clean Air Act, for example, or in the other environmental programs. And so they are in a position where when they get themselves disciplined enough about the process, I think they're able to really accomplish a lot in the way that the public lands laws and framework are changed over the course of this administration. So that's concerning, but I do think is the reality that we are dealing with. I have one visual I wanted to share, and that's a chart that basically, it's not really a chart, but just shows a number of the actions, or refers to a number of the actions that have been taken at all levels to influence what the public lands policy is. And I would say this administration, they came in with the focus on energy dominance, and then using all of the tools available, and they had the benefit of both houses of Congress and the presidency, using all of the tools available, were able to make changes that are designed to sort of shift the direction and the way that we approach our public lands. I'm going to touch on a couple of these because obviously we're not going to talk about this full suite, but I wanted to start with the Congressional Review Act activities just to sort of mark the notion that if at a conference where we're really focused on rationality, to me, the Congressional Review Act itself is the antithesis of that. And this is the statute that had not been used very much before the Trump administration came into effect with Congress, with both houses on its side. But during the administration has used it at least 15 times to eliminate regulations that were done in the latter part of the Obama administration. And 3 of those were relevant to the Department of Interior, one called the BLM planning rule, one the stream protection, and then another that involves sort of Alaska Wildlife Refuge management. And the thing that's important about that is with no hearings or minimal process and no required justification and just a simple majority, the Congressional Review Act really allows Congress to wipe out the product of years of study and public process and stakeholder engagement in ways that I think really undermine all of the work that went on before that to sort of put those in place. And the stream protection rule, which was a rule that was issued at the end of the term, the Obama term, they had spent 7 years on that rule, and to have it sort of eliminated so quickly, I think, is a great concern of this particular mechanism. And once it's eliminated through the congressional review process, the agency can't issue another regulation that's substantially similar to that without congressional approval. And so that is one that I think, you've seen lots of calls for reform of that, having, once we've sort of recognized the way in which it can be very harmful to what I would say is rational policy making. The other items that I think are shown up on the list, you put presidential executive orders, the DOI delaying, suspending rules that involved hydraulic fracturing and methane and royalty rates, their use of changes in resource management plans, sage grouse being one that's gotten a lot of attention because it involves so many acres of land in so many states and was done over a long period of time with a fair degree of coordination and consensus among the states, are all underway in their development. Sage grouse, there's been a proposal, not a final plan, but they're in process of trying to make these changes. Just as they're in process on kind of two of the more significant changes and reductions of protections on Bears Ears and Grand Staircase, two monuments in which they have proposed to revoke what was done by the Obama and Clinton administrations, and those management plans for those areas are underway as well. And I think those two actions in particular are sort of reflective of the strategy that has, I think, a couple of key pillars. One is to make as much land available for extractive purposes as possible, which includes eliminating protections of monuments or of areas that were designated for withdrawal, or using the management planning process itself to kind of change the use. Once they have eliminated those, to really increase and allow much greater leasing opportunities, either both onshore and offshore. I think the administration is very proud of the fact that they are making leasing opportunities much more available than had been done in the past. And this leasing, I think, is important in that it does create, particularly on onshore, it does create an impediment to actually taking that land in the future and doing something else with it, because once it's leased and it's locked up for a certain number of years with some expectations and property right interests that are of value, that will make it difficult in the future to think about doing other things with it. But I want to turn now to just a couple of process issues, because in addition to the things that I've just alluded to, they are also sort of changing the way in which we go through the management planning process, with a lot of focus on trying to streamline those processes, to eliminate the opportunity for comment by the public, either by shortening the times or finding ways so that you don't have to allow public process at all. And these are being done both on their own regulations, but also on regulations that where there are guidance that affects the National Environmental Policy Act, which itself is has been set up for some review or regulation. So for those who don't know, the National Environmental Policy Act is often referred to as the Magna Carta in the environmental area, as one of the first statutes to really set forth a planning process that involved and required the considered analysis of various impacts before you made a decision, before the federal government made a decision on taking an action. And the regulations have been in place since the 70s. And last August, President Trump issued an executive order in which he laid out what's been the task that the White House has been engaged in for over the last year, of trying to encourage what they call greater discipline in the planning process, and calling on the Council on Environmental Quality, my former agency, to help lead efforts to streamline and to facilitate the maximizing whatever opportunities are possible under NEPA to more quickly and in an orderly way address the environmental issues. So in that vein, CEQ actually issued a notice of, an advance notice of proposed rulemaking this summer. They put it out for first a 30-day comment period. It was expanded to 60. And in it, they asked a series of questions that essentially go to every aspect of the NEPA process. Some of it, the more, mundane operational questions, like should they change the number of pages? Should they take steps that will make it more possible for agencies to coordinate various processes? Things that I think sound as if they are innocuous. And I think it's really partly the concern of knowing kind of the other steps that are being taken in other parts of the administration that has people nervous about what they're going to do, having set the stage for really opening up all parts of the regulation, including like basic definitions that have been in place for years. And I think it creates this awkwardness for the advocacy community and others, because anybody who's been involved in NEPA would not say that NEPA couldn't be spruced up or couldn't be improved. And yet, I think the concern about what that will mean if you open that up is one that is pretty great. But they've received 12,000 comments on the rule, including about 300 or so that are substantive comments. And so they're, in theory, in the process of determining what a proposal will look like. Another thing that causes pause or concern about where they might be going in the NEPA area is another area in which the Council on Environmental Quality has been playing a big role, and that is on helping with the infrastructure, what they hope would be infrastructure legislation coming in the future. The administration issued a plan that lays out what they think should be in some valuable legislation that would encourage infrastructure. And included in that is a section on environmental management, and basically every environmental statute is somehow covered in there, but it includes on areas that are relevant to the National Environmental Policy Act a reinforcement of the idea of getting the NEPA document done in 2 years, of only allowing 90 days for a period between the time the environmental document is finished and there being a decision, but also eliminates EPA's role in evaluating the quality of the document, saying that EPA can sort of comment like everyone else, but the whole idea of there being a process in which EPA would actually make a determination on whether the document meets the basic standards that are applied would be eliminated. And making it easier for there to be categorical exclusions, which get rid of the whole need for doing public process, are all reflected in this infrastructure plan that they put out. And so I think the idea that we might see many of those things pulled over into to an actual proposal would not be surprising. The last thing I want to mention, which is in the category of another sort of process change, has to do with compensatory mitigation. And this is now back at the Department of Interior. Mitigation, as I think many of you know, has been a tool that the agencies have used for some time. I think initially in the kind of 80s, there was a lot of resistance in environmental communities about the idea of people using mitigation as a way to get their permits and to sort of essentially buy their permits from the agencies. But it has become a very important and a consistent part of the process, not only in the Clean Water Act area where it started, but I think across agencies, and DOI has certainly taken advantage of it. And during the Obama years, there was a lot of effort sort of put into looking at mitigation policies, requiring that we move from a kind of no net loss standard to actually thinking about having net benefits, recognizing the uncertainties that exist in areas where mitigation is offered, recognizing that in an age of climate change that there are more areas that are affected in ways that we ought to be protecting for. And so there were a number of both policy documents and legal documents during the Obama administration that were eliminated by the Trump administration slowly over the course of the last 21 months. They were sort of rescinded the presidential memo that Obama did. Zinke then revoked sort of secretarial orders that addressed mitigation. Bernhardt, his deputy, revoked other handbook documents that dealt with mitigation. And then most recently, in this summer, they issued a compensatory mitigation, a mitigation document that addresses compensatory mitigation and says that essentially that BLM will not require, in fact shall not require, that compensatory mitigation is used as a way to, as a condition for getting a permit or an approval or authorization in its process. They go on to say that there might be voluntary compensatory mitigation that's allowed if the industry person wants to offer it. So it does raise a question about on the ground and in practice, how will that actually work? But the message that the staff is being given and that the agencies are being given more broadly is just that the idea of having compensatory mitigation as a tool or something that BLM can rely on in setting up its permitting process is no longer available. And the logic for that was less than clear in the analysis or the document that was put out. And so I think the agency is is sort of questioning exactly what role mitigation in general, but certainly compensatory mitigation should be having in the way that they're evaluating their decisions. And without mitigation, I think that will raise the question of, well, does that mean there will just be damage to areas without there being any effort to replace those, or does that mean that there's some expectation that BLM is actually going to say no to some of these permit decisions, which seems less likely. So I'm going to stop there. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so the way we split this up is that I'm going to talk a little bit about litigation, and again, I think Vicki, Patton, and I were talking about this a little bit, that the title of this conference was a little challenging in the quest for rationality idea, and I think that in the litigation context, what we're seeing is that there really isn't a quest for rationality. Rather, the quest seems to be to undo anything that relates to conservation, especially conservation in the last administration, but really not just that. And I work a lot on with the Bureau of Land Management, which is the biggest land manager actually in the country. And in addition to managing most of the most surface estate in the country, about 250 million acres, they manage all the mineral estate, which means they handle all the oil and gas leasing for all the federal agencies and all the coal. So they are pretty much the favorite agency of this administration. They've been very, very, very busy. So they've also been the target of a lot of litigation. And so what we're seeing is there's a lot of claims of rationality and economic principles to support actions that undermine conservation, but what we're seeing is that they're not really living up to that, and the courts are noticing it. And the reason I put this cartoon up here is I think that the courts are noticing it, and we're seeing some rather snarky language in some of the decisions that are coming down. And honestly, I at least am kind of enjoying that. So I've picked a couple of those to share with you. In one of the topics that has come up a few times now are related to BLM's methane rule. And so the methane has to do with the fact that when you produce oil, you also produce natural gas. And in natural gas, we you can either vent or leak or flare. So if you ever see pictures of giant flames coming out, if you've seen There Will Be Blood, what that is the flaring of the natural gas that comes off, and sometimes you want to capture that and sell it, and sometimes, that's just annoying. And so the reason that we want oil and gas producers to capture that is because methane is one of the most devastating in terms of effect of climate change, but also if as a producer you capture that natural gas, you sell it, and we, the American people, get the royalties. So there's a fiscal and an environmental responsibility there. And under the Obama administration, a rule was issued to require actually checking for leaks, imagine that, and also capturing the gas and selling for royalties. So there was a lawsuit brought right at the end of the Obama administration by a couple of states and some companies to try to kill the rule, but well, that didn't work. There was also an effort, Brenda mentioned the Congressional Review Act, there was an effort to end the methane rule that was in effect under the Congressional Review Act. That was stopped by John McCain. There's some great video of him going up to vote and this giant gaggle of Republican senators trying to stop him, and he shoves them out of the way and gives them the thumb down. It's very dramatic if you watch C-SPAN. I don't, but somebody sent me a clip. After that, the BLM tried in June 2017 to just issue a rule under Section 705 of the Administrative Procedure Act, which allows you to delay the effective date of regulations. Now, delay the effective date of regulations. That would indicate that would be for regulations not in effect. This regulation was in effect. So they just tried anyway. The court said, no, you actually can't do that, with quite a bit of snarky language, and said you cannot actually use this for date regulations already in effect. And in terms of the economics and rationality, this is some of the language about highlighting the fact that this actually caused more uncertainty for industry, not less. So they tried again in December 17 when they issued a new rule to suspend the rule, and I think Vicki mentioned this one again. And in this situation, a court actually enjoined the suspension rule. And for those of you who have recently been studying the rules of civil procedure in class, this is a very high bar. It's not easy to get an injunction. But the court said that the reasoning here was untethered to evidence. So they weren't just granting an injunction, they were pretty much insulting the suspension rule and noting that there is irreparable harm was shown by putting this in effect. So again, just last week, a new suspension rule, a rescission rule was just issued, and it was published in the Federal Register today. There was already a complaint filed in the Northern District of California by the states of California and New Mexico last week. With the rule being published today, I really hope and believe that the Wilderness Society and a number of other groups will be filing our case today. But the complaint filed by California and New Mexico has some pretty snarky language as well, noting that this is a rule that repeals requirements that just 2 years ago BLM determined were necessary to fulfill its statutory mandates to avoid waste. So we'll see where this one goes, but I'm optimistic we'll get some new snarky language from the courts in California. So moving on, another one I wanted to highlight for Rationale has to do with some challenges to oil and gas leasing in sage-grouse habitats. So how many people have seen a sage-grouse? Oh, good, okay, a couple. So there's a picture of a sage-grouse. It's often referred to as a chicken-sized, dun-colored, flightless bird. I put this picture in here to show you it's not all those things. It does also fly when chased by raptors or water trucks moving to drill. And then how many people here have purchased oil and gas leases? Okay, so what you should know about those, and the reason that this lawsuit was brought, is once you, and Brenda kind of referred to this, once you purchase an oil and gas lease on federal land, it's good for at least 10 years. You can get it extended beyond that as long as you drill, or if you ask the Bureau of Land Management to extend it for you. So once leases are issued, this has a huge impact on federal land. And this administration changed the way that leasing was happening on our federal lands, that it was no longer required for the Bureau of Land Management to conduct environmental review before issuing leases, no longer required to allow public comment. We are still allowed to file administrative protests, but we only get 10 days to do that. And if you issue the decision on a Friday, that 10 days goes by pretty quickly. Also, you're not allowed to email in a protest. You have to fax them. Anybody on a fax machine? Yes, very challenging. So, you do. Thank you. I might be by to borrow that. We're running low. So this process has become complicated. The stated purpose of the new guidance was to simplify and streamline the leasing process to alleviate non-necessary impediments and burdens. What do those burdens look like? You're looking at it. In case you're wondering. Me and the sage-grouse both. Okay, so this case was brought, and the court enjoined the guidance. So that would be 2 injunctions, at least so far in this little overview. And if you read this, again, we had some pretty snarky stuff going on here. The court says the public involvement requirements of FLTMA, which is the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, this is the organic act that governs the Bureau of Land Management, and NEPA, the bedrock environmental law of public involvement and environmental overview, can't be set aside in the name of expediting oil and gas sales. The benefits of public involvement and the mechanism by which public involvement is obtained are not, quote, unnecessary impediments and burdens. Okay. So again, they're really seeing the courts kind of calling it on the fact that these are not rational and meaningful. And a lot of this is, again, we see these economic arguments and they're just a cloak for, we just want to make it easier to drill. So the last one I did want to highlight here, and I don't know what happened to the formatting here, so I'm sorry that this is going to be hard to read. And this is in litigation. So far the snarkiness has not occurred, but I feel good about it coming. I have a little bit, but these arose out of, these cases arose out of the original review that was conducted pursuant to an executive order issued by President Trump, which he asked Secretary of the Interior Zinke to review 27 national monuments that were issued by that were created by previous presidents. And this is, again, a place where we see going on beyond kind of rational new rationales again. And here, the review for the monuments were factors well beyond what the Antiquities Act created. The Antiquities Act of 1906 kind of directed presidents to designate national monuments to protect antiquities. Here we have Secretary Zinke being told to look at, and I'll just read some of them, national monuments to look at, for instance, let's see, fun things like, were they appropriately classified under the Act? Do they look at the right considerance of multiple use policy? Well, of course they don't, because they're Antiquities Act monuments. Do they have impacts on the available use of lands outside the boundaries? Do they impact concerns of state and local governments? Do they affect the available of federal resources outside the boundaries? So looking at all sorts of factors that have nothing to do with the designation of monuments, and that courts historically, because we have seen the designation of monuments challenged over the years, have explicitly declined to consider. We're now challenging the radical reductions of the Bears Ears National Monument by 85% and the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument by about half. In court, but the new proclamations that were issued by President Trump follow this kind of same pattern of the rationale. So you'll see that they determine, that they both state that the new proclamations were issued because we've determined that he's determined the appropriate protective area involves the examination of factors such as the uniqueness and nature of the objects, the nature of the needed protections, and the protection provided by other laws. Again, none of these are factors that are supposed to be taken into account under the Antiquities Act or have ever been considered by courts. In the Bears Ears Proclamation, there's a message, there's a whole section about how there wasn't a sufficient threat of damage or destruction to these objects. And we'll set aside the fact that the Bears Ears area had been subjected to repeated threats of destruction. If you follow any of the news in this area, the town of Blanding, which is right outside the monument, there have been two separate incidents about 20 years apart where large segments of the population were arrested for looting in the what is now Bears Ears, and selling large amounts of antiquities to pot hunters. So even if we actually needed to meet the standard, it was met. But let's just set that aside. It wasn't a requirement. The requirement is that the president has decided this area should be set aside for future generations. We don't need to actually show that people are stealing the cultural resources or destroying the rock art. Similarly, in the Grand Staircase, the proclamation talks about how some of these areas are already being managed by the Forest Service because they're roadless, or by the BLM because they're under protection as wilderness study areas. What that has to do with protecting some of the most amazing dinosaur fossils being found in the world is beyond me, and I don't think you need to actually be a paleontologist to know that that might be a giant load of hooey. So I think we'll continue to see where we're going, and we do know that the real economics at play here, because we've seen documents released, have to do with efforts to turn some of these lands over for leasing, uranium leasing, oil and gas, and coal. We did get some really entertaining snark on Monday. I didn't have a chance to put them in my slides because I didn't get the transcript till yesterday. We did have a hearing status conference in the case where the Department of Justice was declining to give us any notice about what might happen with some new mining claims in the monuments, and the Department of Justice said we didn't need notice because we could get information under the Freedom of Information Act. The court noted that the same attorneys for the plaintiffs who were asking for notice had been in her court multiple times in the preceding week suing for release of documents under the Freedom of Information Act, and so hence she did not feel that was a sufficient remedy. So we did actually achieve some similar lack of belief already in this case, and I hope we'll see some more. So I think we are seeing a lack of rationality and economic basis for actions, and I think we'll continue to see that.
We should all chip in for insurance for NADA. She is on many hits, on the hit list for the oil and gas industry. And she's right, she's the main irritant to that industry. And is doing great work, by the way. The Wilderness Society is a phenomenal organization on these issues. So I've kind of revamped my talk a little bit as the afternoon has gone on. And I want to just make a few, hopefully, important observations. First, I want to thank Ricky and Jayni and the whole policy integrity crew. What you've been hearing today is so true. They have brought a disciplined and economic analysis into some of the most important energy and environmental issues of the day. And I was marveling as I looked at briefs and opinions on some of the things I'll talk about briefly here today. IPI is all over the place doing amicus briefs that go right to the heart of the Administrative Procedures Act questions about whether rulemaking changes have enough of an explanation behind them to pass muster under the APA. And time and again, their analysis has been central to decision making. So it's interesting to apply to look at how cost-benefit analysis applies when it comes to natural resources, because it's a little bit of a different context than we've been talking about. And it's particularly pertinent today because a lot of the environmental rollbacks that the Trump administration has been doing have focused disproportionately, I would say, on public lands. Why? Much of the push for deregulation, so-called deregulation, some might call it abdication, is to reduce economic burdens on the energy industry. And you can do that somewhat indirectly in non-public lands contexts. You can do it directly in public lands context. Indirectly, the energy industry has been affected by EPA regulations of all sorts, of course. The coal sector, the Clean Power Plan, for example, in particular. And you're in an EPA context in which there is a well-developed set of statutory expectations of cost-benefit history and analysis, and the tools are there for a robust discussion, but the feds have to deal with the reality that they're not making all the decisions. When it comes to the public lands, it's different. So the public lands, I will admit, for the first half of my legal career, I was an EPA-oriented lawyer. Bruce Babbitt asked me to come into the Clinton administration as his counselor in 1997, and I'd done some pro bono work on wilderness stuff. I said, sure. But the scales fell from my eyes when I realized the Interior Department, together with the Forest Service, controls 1/3 of the land mass of the United States and controls the offshore oil and gas resources, and later now the wind resources offshore. It is the Department of Energy, and historically 25% of the oil and gas produced in the United States comes from the public lands. That's actually declining a little bit because of the importance of shale resources, which are primarily on state and private lands. But it is a potential playground, if you will, for the Trump administration to show how we are going to achieve, as Jayni said, energy dominance. This was a primary goal of the deregulation. Let's stop requiring industry to have all of these burdens that are stopping our oil and gas and coal production from proceeding. Well, in part because of the history of the Interior Department domination, if you will, of public lands and its decision-making authority, we have now a regulatory history that is developed that is bringing to fruition, actually right now, some of the key questions about whether the emphasis on economic burdens, which is the primary motivation for several major rules, will pass muster in the courts. Interestingly, there's been a number of, I'm going to talk briefly about 4 areas in the public lands energy context. I'm going to talk about fracking rules. I'm going to talk about briefly the methane waste reduction rule that has been mentioned before, valuation rules, and also offshore drilling rules. All of these areas have been areas where the Obama administration had come up with long-needed reforms that reached fruition in final rules that became effective before the change of administration, and that the Trump administration came with a bullseye on to not repeal and replace, but just repeal. Let's go back to where we were before. Before the Obama fracking rule, there were no rules on fracking requirements for the 94,000 wells on public lands. Number 2, methane waste reduction rule. Let's go back to where we were before, when oil and gas operators had essentially no restrictions on how much methane was vented or flared in connection with oil and gas operation. No small issue, by the way. Still at night, from satellites, you can see North Dakota light up. Why? They're venting, well, they're flaring natural gas, which gets in the way of the more economically viable oil supplies. And they don't have the infrastructure yet, the gas pipelines, to get this lower value natural gas. So let's just forget about it. It's methane. It's 4.1% estimates of the gas production out of the public lands goes up. And it's a powerful greenhouse gas emitter, obviously. The valuation rule, okay, so big reform. This is an interesting one, where the federal government realized that oil and gas and coal companies, particularly coal companies, were taking advantage of the royalty rules. The royalties are based on a statutory percentage, 12.5% of the value of the coal that's taken out of the ground is due to the federal government, is due to all of us as taxpayers. Okay, well, how do you figure out what the market price is? Well, the coal companies came up with an interesting approach. Their first sale, which was the test for it, was what's your first sale? First sale was to an affiliate at a very low price, and then you had an arm's length transaction at a much higher price. So we all got screwed, basically, by virtue of the fact that the royalty was based on an inappropriate base. And the reform came in and said, let's not do it that way. Let's look for the first real arm's length transaction. And by the way, there are public indices of the cost of these commodities. Let's look at them too. All right, that one was going to be rolled back too. Now, all 3 of these areas, I get to offshore in a minute, all 3 of these rules were challenged by a combination of state attorneys general, with whom I'm doing a lot of work now through the NYU State Impact Center, and environmental groups. And in part because of the history of the Interior Department, I will say somewhat reluctantly, these rules were not, the Interior Department is not as skilled as EPA is in terms of bolstering rules. That came to the benefit of, I think, all of us who care about these rules. We put a lot of effort into them in the Obama administration. The effort to repeal them back was sort of an approach of never mind. These are burdens. These are burdens on the oil and gas industry. We want more production. Let's take these burdens off. So with fracking, never mind that we don't have any federal rules on fracking, that we don't have any rules to deal with the 30% of the development water that comes back up contaminated. Never mind that we don't have rules on well integrity to avoid groundwater cross-contamination. When it comes to the methane, never mind that we're wasting this public resource, even though the Minerals Releasing Act says we can't do it. When it comes to valuation, never mind that we're not getting full value of royalties. This is too complicated what these guys have put out. We're just going to repeal them. But before they did that, they first tried to say we're not going to enforce them. Then they said we're going to do notice and comment rules to delay them. The courts were not sympathetic. now, and they were required, they had to go through their paces and actually do substantive notice and comment rules. Guess what? Those are now maturing in each of these areas. The fracking rule, the rollback, the final rule rollback, again, kind of a never mind rule, was finalized about a year ago. Attorney General Becerra and Attorney General Hector Balceras in California and New Mexico both filed suit against this because, among other things, the fracking, I'm sorry, I was thinking of the valuation rule. The fracking rule was, I believe those two were also involved in the fracking rule. But in any event, the lawsuit that was filed is now, the administrative record is now being put together right now on the fracking litigation, and we're going to find out if the analysis that was done was adequate or not. On methane, last week, the final methane rule came out, the waste valuation rule, and the valuation rule, let's see here, let me get this straight. The valuation rule, the valuation rule is the one that was challenged in October 2017. We have a hearing on October 10th, and among other things, Policy Integrity has a terrific brief filed. So in all of these issues, we're going to see the test. How far do you get by just looking at the burden on the energy industry? The premise of the administration on all of these has been the economic burden is unnecessary and it's stopping energy dominance. So on fracking, what will the answer be? Is it enough to simply say, we think that there are other protections, we haven't really analyzed them carefully, we did this rule pretty quickly because we were told to? I don't think it's going to work. On the methane waste reduction side, this is the most stark example of a rule that I think is going to generate good law in terms of a decision that says this replacement rule, this kind of never mind, we're going back to status quo ante, is not going to work. Why? Because yes, they looked at the costs, and guess what? The costs are not that significant. Plus, the law is pretty clear, you're not supposed to waste. This isn't just a cost-benefit analysis. You start with what the law says, no waste. Let's look at the decision of what they did and look at the analysis of it. The costs were not that high. And in fact, that gas is valuable and could be collected and could provide a cost. But more importantly, the methane, the 4.1% of the methane is a huge amount of methane. And the foregone benefits of not addressing though the benefits that would have occurred if that methane, that climate change impacting methane had not gone up into the air, were not analyzed essentially at all. The effort was, there was an effort to have a new regulatory impact analysis in 2018 that redid the social cost of methane, that took into, that rejiggered it in ways that were mentioned in the previous panel. That's going to come to the fore as well, but on a background of costs that are relatively insignificant and foregone benefits that are very significant, and I think we're going to see if a court is going to put up with the social costs of methane analysis. Very important. On the valuation side, same thing. It's like, never mind, we're going to go back and just make different decisions about, maybe we're going to put together a committee to look at these royalties and make a decision perhaps on whether we go back to the reform or just leave it the way it is or whatever. But in any event, we want to have more production. And these, not being able to take advantage of this potential fraud is a problem. So this is the record that they're going to be judged on. The final example that I want to mention in the oil and gas area is when it comes to the offshore oil and gas leasing and drilling requirements. I was the first administration official in the Gulf of Mexico on the morning of April 21, 2010, and went through the Gulf oil spill. And what came out of that, among many other things, were some reforms in terms of rulemakings to avoid another catastrophic spill like that. Just today, or yesterday, Coral Davenport was reporting in the New York Times, we're seeing the first of 2 final rules that are coming out of the Interior Department to roll back important pieces of those reforms. Those will be litigated, and how they will be evaluated will tell us a lot about here one of the special challenges in terms of cost-benefit analysis, and I hope that policy integrity will help us on this. To me, this is one of the hardest things about judging the economics in a public lands concept. How do you deal with a black swan event? A situation where you have a very low probability of a disaster occurring, but a very, very high impact. There is an inclination to discount greatly that risk. We've seen that risk, though, and particularly in the public land context, whether you take the Exxon Valdez or here Deepwater Horizon, very interesting, important activities. I want to just briefly mention one other area where the focus on energy and cost-benefit and sort of economics is particularly important. And it's a different natural resources context. I've been focusing just on the public lands here. But there's, with regard to energy production and in particular building of gas pipelines, there's another huge set of environmental issues associated with that. And we have a different regulator on the federal side, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, approving gas pipelines. Because it's in the federal context, much like the interior context decisions, we have another factor at play. In addition to special laws that may affect different types of energy production, like we're seeing, for example, with oil and gas production on the public lands, where you need to have a fair market value through the valuation reform. You have, when it comes to gas pipelines, a NEPA requirement, a requirement that the federal decision maker decide on this gas pipeline going in or not based on a full consideration of alternatives, full consideration of potential impacts, including climate impacts, and we have a lot of controversy right now in this area because the FERC approach has been to, number one, not look at gas pipelines in a broader context, which brings us today 2 parallel gas pipelines from the Appalachians through Virginia into the southeast, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline and the Mountain Valley Pipeline. Gee, you'd think there would be a consideration of regional considerations there, and without looking beyond the blinders of, well, there's some folks who want this gas, and there's some folks who can get this gas to them. Is the gas needed from a perspective of energy production? Those issues aren't being looked at from NEPA, nor now, despite a DC Circuit decision on Sabel Trail pipeline, is FERC looking at least the majority of FERC wanting to look at downstream climate impacts associated with the burning of that gas. So these issues also are coming to a fore, and in fact, we're going to see the DC Circuit is entertaining briefing right now on sort of the next case after Sabal Trail, Dominion Energy case up in New York State, and looking at the question of whether pipelines need to look at climate change impacts. So my point here is, and I'm almost done, right now we've gone through 2 years basically of sparring under the Administrative Procedure Act. We are finally at the point in this context of public lands in particular at final rules that up and down the line essentially say, never mind, we're just repealing those reforms, going back to the way they were, with, I think, very limited administrative records, very little attention to the prior administrative records that establish some requirements that have to be overcome. And we're going to see what the courts have to say. I'm just thankful that policy integrity is on the case. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much to all three of you. So I'm just going to start out by asking a question. A few of you, Brenda and Nita, you both mentioned sort of the way that this administration has attempted to kind of curtail public access to information and at times public participation. And certainly I think we'd all agree that this administration hasn't been the epitome of transparency. Are there particularly egregious examples of that you haven't yet mentioned? And what are the possible ways around that barrier to all of us, sitting here as members of the public wanting as much information as we can get?
Oh, okay. So I think the example is coming up in some of the proposed changes that have been done to some of the guidance documents. The oil and gas guidance document, which I think was at the center of the Idaho case that Nita talked about, is one in which we've now seen a court that is expressing its unhappiness with the fact that the result of the action is to exclude the public under circumstances that they should have had an opportunity. Other examples, I'm not sure have come to fruition. I don't know if you have any specific leasing ones that you think would be useful to mention.
So we have seen similar in the leasing ones where we won't get a comment period or anything. The first time we'll see a leasing document at all is at the 10-day protest period. So we'll find out that there's 300,000 acres going up for sale, and we'll have 10 days to comment. That'll be the first time we see them. So those are some of the ways they're really excluding the public, or they'll, so that's some of what we've been seeing. The other transparency issues, obviously, we're seeing are in how this administration is wielding or not responding to requests under the Freedom of Information Act. Normally you submit a Freedom of Information Act request, you get some kind of response in the 20 working days. What we're seeing now is we immediately get a response that says this is a complex request. I'm not sure what that meant before, but now it just means you've asked for a document. We saw these things that there was a process in the early days of the energy dominance process that said, you will submit responses in 30 days to the deputy secretary. Unlike when David was the deputy secretary, everything now has to go to the deputy secretary. You want to have more than 100 pages on your EIS, you go to the deputy secretary. You want to defer your lease from lease sale, you go to the deputy secretary. You also submit a list of energy policies that burden energy development to the deputy secretary. So everybody was submitting these in 30 days. So we submitted a FOIA request that said, we would like to see what the Bureau of Land Management submitted. We got a response that said, that's complex because it's going to so many places. We said, well, it's going to David Bernhardt's desk. But anyway, so we get complex, then we have to wait. I now got a letter this week from the Fish and Wildlife Service, and literally the subject line was still interested letter. There's now a new form letter called a still interested letter, which is something you get if you submitted something 16 months ago and haven't gotten a response, in which they ask you if you're still interested. I said I was. I don't know what will happen, but that's what we're seeing. So what we're finding is if you don't sue, literally if you don't sue, you often don't get a response. So that's what we found you have to do. And we are getting that indication sometimes from the agencies that that's the way we will get documents that we would normally get as a matter of course, and that is very frustrating to see.
Can I just add the point that traditionally NEPA has played a key role for federal decision makers in requiring significant public input. NEPA is one of those areas now where there's a systemic proposal out there to do make some major changes in the NEPA process through regulations. And what we're seeing out of the administration is not encouraging in terms of their understanding that NEPA is actually a really important disclosure statute that needs to be informed by outside expertise, et cetera. Obviously, they got rid of the guidance that Brenda was so involved in to require climate change considerations to be taken into account. And unfortunately, the structure at the Interior Department for in the oil and gas sector is really unacceptable in that individual leasing decisions are not subject to significant NEPA review. They're sort of covered or not, but covered by larger area EISs much earlier. So it's a real problem, particularly in an area where the government's in charge, and you would expect that there'd be more public input.
Great, thanks. Actually, before I go on, I have a card here from the Comedy Cellar down the street, and it says, Nada, I heard your set, and we would love for you to come audition tonight. I'm kidding. But really, it's across the street. So one question, final question for me, and then I will read some actual card questions. So we did a lot of work, as you know, on fair return, and a lot of the government's own studies show that if they actually raised the royalty rates and leased less at once, the public would get a higher return and greenhouse gas emissions would go down. Setting aside for a moment the greenhouse gas emission benefits, just focusing on fair return, are you surprised that Republicans, even in Congress or in this administration, aren't receptive to this practice and instead have been doing the opposite when it's an economically bad deal?
I'm not surprised. I was going to mention that in an earlier version of my comments, but the metrics that this administration are using in part to determine whether they are achieving energy dominance are geographic metrics. Are we now drilling where we couldn't before? The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, the Teshupik Lake area of the National Petroleum Reserve, North Fork Valley in Colorado, et cetera. And how big are our lease sales? Why don't we put them all together? And let's go ahead and put Nevada on the block, which they did, and they got 0 bids, but they had a lot that was available. So it's just an unfortunate reality that despite the other rhetoric that they're interested in increasing the amount of royalties coming in, they're much more looking for the headlines that they can point to say we're expanding our footprint. And similarly, I will say the offshore, the notion of opening up 90% of the offshore land, this was also done right at the end of the Bush administration. When we came in the Obama administration, we had public meetings around the country. The one in San Francisco I will never forget. I'd never seen that many humanoids that were in polar bear outfits. Guess what? California's never going to allow offshore drilling, and actually the law says you should look to the states for guidance, and there's no infrastructure. It was all rhetoric. The notion that Massachusetts and New York is going to have offshore oil drilling, again, it's unfortunate, but it's kind of the hyperbole of energy dominance rhetoric itself, and this is how it's exhibited.
Yeah, I was going to add that I think that's part of what feeds into the response that a lot of their activities just seem designed to be responsive to their closest allies, to a lot of the discussion about being in the pocket of industry and whatever their not all industry even, but particular industry that has been very supportive of the certain parts of the administration, that's what gives some truth to that, because it doesn't line up with what has been historic Republican ideology.
Okay, great. So I have two questions from the audience, and I'm going to read them both, and maybe you can pick which one you'd like to respond to. So first, can you comment on the likely outcome of the monuments litigation? And maybe if you don't want to comment on the particular outcome, what sort of key factors do you think it'll hinge on? And then the second question is, are there ways that states can pick up the slack as the federal government abdicates its responsibility on public lands? For example, Colorado now leading on methane capture.
I guess I can start with the monuments. I think we're optimistic that we will prevail on the monuments litigation. We think that there is a lot of support for our position that the president has exceeded his authority by essentially revoking the monuments and also by slashing them the way he has. It just really exceeds the language in the statutes, and I could go on for a really long time about why we think that. So if anyone would like to discuss that in detail, I'm available. But we really think we have a good argument there, and that we will prevail. So.
On the states picking up the slack, I mean, one of the things that I've thought about states, sort of looking at the role that they've taken on in the climate area, is whether or not activities that they could do that related to their own state lands, the existence of that might be provide ammunition as we try to push public lands policy, federal public lands policy, when we get the chance. And so I do think that there is a benefit to this, friendly states doing great things on state lands and creating policy that show how you can advance the protection of state lands that we can use as a encouragement once we are back in power.
So was the question on states just focused on the oil and gas industry?
No, I think it's more broad than that, just all kind of public lands.
Yeah. No, I think the states can be very important, and we've seen that. We've seen leadership, for example, out of Colorado on fracking. Governor Hickenlooper put together a process and brought the more responsible oil and gas companies to the table, and they had a good political situation there where there was a real concern about whether fracking could continue. And anyway, the folks came together and arguably created a model statute. I will say that one of the reasons why the Interior Department pushed for its own fracking rule is because there actually is such a variation among the states in terms of how seriously they take these issues. So more generally, I think what you're seeing are the progressive states getting more involved in these issues generally, and by these issues I mean public trust issues, public resource issues. An example, frankly, is the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. We're not talking about energy here, although we are actually, because arguably one of the reasons why the Interior Department reinterpreted the 1918 Act to take away strict liability was because the oil industry was not happy about being prosecuted for dead birds on oil ponds. But a number of progressive states filed suit here in the Southern District of New York, led by Attorney General Underwood, to get a declaratory judgment that that new interpretation doesn't comport with the law.
Okay, great. We only have a couple of minutes left, but I wanted to ask one final question, which is, are there any examples of this Department of the Interior or BLM being responsible stewards? Anything that surprisingly you think they've gotten right, or room to be optimistic?
Okay. I'm just going to surprise everyone and give an example. So one place we have seen the department, or I guess two places they've stood with us, is where they have been defending their authority, their discretion. One of those places, interestingly, is in their authority and discretion to cancel oil and gas leases that were issued improperly. So we had some in Colorado in an area called the Thompson Divide that were issued improperly without compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act, and also in Montana in an area called the Badger 2 Medicine. Those leases were issued improperly for failure to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act and the National Historic Preservation Act. And when this administration came into power, partway through those cases that have been challenged by the leaseholders, I can tell you we were very worried that they would change their position. Boy, were we glad we'd been granted intervention status. But they have stood with us. We'll see how that goes. The Thompson Divide case recently settled, but Judge Leon in the District Court for the District of Columbia on Monday ruled in favor of the leaseholders in Montana. So we'll see if they appeal with us and the Blackfeet tribe, but that was one place. And in the other, they have been very ardently defending their discretion to actually designate the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument and the marine monuments, the Northeast Canyons and Seamounts. So that's partially, I think, to bolster their authority to also cut the monuments down in Utah, but those are two places we've been surprised at the way they've defended their discretion.
They also are in the monument space. It's supporting the creation of a couple of monuments, which we think of as being somewhat cynical, but historic monuments in Kentucky, Camp Nelson, and another that I don't remember the name, but they were sort of Civil War era monuments that recognize the contribution of African American soldiers, and so that was good to see.
And I would just say, I think one of the reasons why many of us were hopeful about this administration and the public lands was Secretary Zinke's commitment early on not to agree with some states that were looking to essentially take over public lands into state ownership and potentially dispossess some of those lands. And they've been true to that, I'd say by and large, and are protecting the federal ownership. What's unfortunate, and per our discussion here, is that while federal ownership continues, leasing some of these particularly sensitive lands for oil and gas development is akin to privatizing those lands, and that's the primary focus of disappointment, I would say, in terms of their overall lands policy.
Okay, well, thanks so much to the three speakers we had today.